Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this legislative preview luncheon today. My name is Tim Sink. I'm president of the Greater Concord Chamber of Commerce. I want to welcome folks that are here both in person, and a number of folks are also joining us virtually. So thank you for being here. I will mention that during the Q&A, there is an opportunity for you to ask questions of the panelists. And if you're attending virtually, you do that through chat, and we will get the question to the moderator. A couple of quick announcements I'd like to mention before we get started. First of all, we've got some upcoming events that you may be interested in. On January 18th at 10 a.m., we're hosting a webinar with Orr in Reno, and the subject matter is OSHA is knocking, are you ready? This is really in anticipation of what's happening with vaccine mandates and complying with that, and making sure you're prepared if you have a business that has more than 100 employees, what you need to know in order to be prepared in case that happens. So that again is on the 18th at 10 a.m. You can register through the chamber. I don't believe there's any cost to attend that event. Also, the Concord Young Professional Network will gather at Litherman's Brewery on the 19th of January at 5:30 p.m. for a monthly networking and social event. And then the last thing I'll mention is that on January 25th, we are hosting a webinar on career pathways to your business. It's part of our workforce initiative, and this is an opportunity to hear from experts in terms of how you engage students, typically high school students that may be interested in pursuing a career path in your particular field. So you can register for any of those events online at concordnhchamber.com. Big thanks today to Ledyard National Bank, who is our sponsor. They are terrific corporate citizens. They've been very, very active with the Chamber and other organizations locally, so we're really pleased that they are sponsoring this event. We have a number of Ledyard reps that are joining us both virtually and in person. Scott Laffenhaus is Senior Vice President and Regional Executive for Ledyard Bank. He's a member of the Board of Directors, and Scott will do the honor of introducing our moderator, who will then introduce our panel. So I will turn this over to Scott Laffenhaus.
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate it. Ledyard appreciates the opportunity for this sponsorship today. And just for clarity, I'm on the board of the chamber, not the board of the bank, which I was called out on at a business after hours one time based on my nameplate. But yes, my role at Ledyard is to lead our continued commitment here in the capital region, Concord specifically. We've got a full team committed to that. We've been, as Tim said, very active with the chamber and have appreciated our partnership with the chamber. We've also tried to be very connected with and supportive of the charitable and service organizations in the capital here. We have quite a team dedicated strictly to Concord, and that includes Christos Hatzidakis, who is our branch manager and leads our retail effort here. We're right at 1 Pillsbury Street on the corner of South Main Street. Located there as well is Tiffany Staples, who's a dedicated residential mortgage loan originator. We also, as you probably know from over the years, we have Diane DeStefano as with Ledyard Financial Advisors as a financial advisor, as well as Monique Brown in the same capacity. Those folks are located at 1 Pillsbury Street. I probably said Pillsbury Street for the branch. That would have been 1 Pearly Street at the corner of South Main. With Monique and Diane, we have Karen Crump, a portfolio manager with Ledyard Financial Advisors. Jeff Trombley lives here in Concord, has been very active with the chamber, and is a portfolio manager as well. Michael Hackhoun is our executive director of Ledyard Financial Advisors. He is also on the call. Tori Wainwright is cash management throughout our organization, and I get her introduced here appropriately. So our Commitment to Concord continues. We appreciate our partnership with the Chamber and the opportunity to sponsor this event. With that, I will introduce our friend David Juve, a graduate of Arizona State University, dedicated Sun Devil. That wasn't here. I'm improvising a little bit on that. Hope that's okay, David. He received a bachelor's degree in history and political science there, and he began his career there in Arizona with the Arizona Automobile Association in '81, and has accumulated more than 35 years of experience in government relations, lobbying, public policy advocacy, media relations, marketing, and public relations. His career with the Business Industry Association began in New Hampshire, the statewide Chamber of Commerce, and leading business advocate. And April 2000 as a vice president, was promoted to senior vice president in January of '08. In this role, David guides public policy development and legislative activity for the association and supervises BIA's lobbying team. Our moderator for today, David Juve, thank you. And David will introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And thanks to Tim Sink and the Concord Chamber for pulling together this program and for asking me to moderate, something I'm very happy to do because I get to work with three State House journalists whom I've worked with professionally for many years, in at least one panelist case for decades. And so I'm thrilled to be acting as a moderator for this panel. Before I introduce them, let me talk a little bit about the format. I've got a couple of questions that I'll be asking panelists just to get the discussion started. In the second half of the presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask your own questions. And as Tim mentioned, for those of you who are live streaming, attending the event virtually, please use the chat function if you have a question, and those will get forwarded to me so I can pass them on to the panel. Our panelists today are Annmarie Timmons. Annmarie is a senior reporter and is a New Hampshire native who covered state government, courts, and social justice issues for the Concord Monitor for 25 years. During her time with the Monitor, she won a Nieman Fellowship to study journalism and mental health courts at Harvard for a year. She's taught journalism at the University of New Hampshire and writing at the Naki S. Loeb School of Communications. Annmarie co-launched the New Hampshire Bulletin, a nonprofit news outlet, in March 2021. This four-person newsroom covers the legislature, state agencies, and public policy with a special focus on health, education, climate, energy, and business. Annmarie, thank you for being here. Our next panelist is Kevin Landrigan. Kevin Landrigan is well known at the State House, having covered it for decades. He's now senior reporter at the New Hampshire Union Leader and has been covering New Hampshire politics since 1980. He's a recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award from the New Hampshire Press Association. And before he became the State House Bureau Chief for the Union Leader, Kevin was a longtime columnist at the Nashua Telegraph, which is where he and I first met each other, where he covered legislative activities at the State House. Our third panelist is Adam Sexton. Adam joined WMUR-TV in November of 2007. Prior to putting down roots in the Granite State, Adam worked at television stations in Oregon and California, where his reporting was recognized with multiple awards from the Associated Press and the Society of Professional Journalists. In 2003, Adam earned a William Randolph Hearst Award and recognition as one of the 5 best collegiate television reporters in America. In 2007, Adam garnered an Emmy nomination for a series of reports on Dragon Skin, a body armor system at the center of a national controversy over protecting American troops. Adam graduated from Syracuse University with degrees in broadcast journalism, history, and political science, and was honored as a university scholar, the most prestigious academic distinction given to undergraduates at Syracuse. And it's not in my prepared remarks, but he's the father of 2 of the most adorable children I've ever met. So well done, Adam. Our first question is, we want to talk about legislative activity, legislative session this year, but I want to start at a 20,000-foot level and then slowly work our way down into individual issues. So a question I would like to ask each panelist is, in New Hampshire, the legislative session is made up of actually two sessions, a first-year session, a second-year session. We're in the second year of that two-year cycle. The first year is primarily focused on putting together the state budget. The second year, you move on to a lot of other issues that may have budget implications but aren't directly related to writing a budget. The second year is also always an election year. And so I'd like to ask our panelists, what is it about being a non-budget year and an election year that characterizes what we're going to see at the State House? And Adam, let me start with you, and then we can work our way this way.
All right, and thank you. How about now?
Yep.
Better? Okay. All right, and thanks, and I'm just proud to be here alongside such distinguished journalists as Annmarie and Kevin. And since I'm the super junior member here in terms of experience, I'll keep it short. But, you know, and you make a good point, Dave, that this is a year that we would normally see some more interesting things come up, right? Because a lot of times people decide to go big with an idea in year two versus year one when they're focused on getting money in the budget. But, you know, there's this kind of unique situation in that so many things were in the budget trailer bill this last time around that, you know, those might have been some things you would have seen in year two, but now you're not. They're already in law. But also there's a bunch of interesting things that are happening this year. I think in some ways, and Kevin, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's almost like some of that dynamic of trying to control, okay, well, here's what we want to talk about in an election year, and let's not do X, Y, or Z. Some of that stuff has gone out the window now, and it's a bit more of a free-for-all in terms of what you see coming out, in particular with different legislative groups that are out there. People are pushing different ideas, and certainly a lot of what's being talked about right now is the pandemic and how to respond to that. Certainly a lot of the bills we're talking about today, but I think, you know, year one, year two, those rules have kind of flown out the window in this session, if you will.
That's a good point, Adam. I think in general that in the election year session, you have much more activity by these special interest groups that across the ideological spectrum who basically want to use this session in order to put members on record on issues that they care about. You see that a lot more in the second year than in the first year. And those issues are very widely, you know, from gun control to abortion rights to, as Adam spoke of this year, the pandemic will be another hot button kind of bellwether issue where members of both political parties will be forced to vote on controversial issues. And you really do that as an interest group in order to find out who your friends are, who isn't on your side. And that very much colors how those groups get involved in these elections and which legislators they decide to target or not. I think one of the things that's unique about this election year session, we'll talk about it more, of course, is redistricting, because every 10 years you redraw the maps for electing members of the House and members of the state Senate. And at the end of the day, the decisions that are made in redistricting often make certain incumbents more vulnerable and other incumbents safer as a result if those maps prevail. So that very much affects the dynamic as well as a lot of legislators behave and as both parties behave.
Thanks. As I listen to you talk, Kevin, I missed your little videos from the State House cafeteria, breaking everything down. What I would add to that is when Governor Sununu said he was not going to run against Senator Hassan, I think it changed a lot in how we are going to think about the session. There's much less pressure on him to vote one way or another. It just becomes a less interesting race. We don't know if anyone will challenge him in a primary. We do not know who may challenge him from the Democratic Party. I think the thinking is he's hard to beat, so that feels like it's gone kind of the back burner. I think what will be interesting is, in addition to the issues, will get a different level of attention this year. When they were all tucked into the budget, it was hard to cover all of them, and I think it got lost for the public too. It felt like it was a foregone conclusion that they would be tucked in there and they would pass. This year, they'll stand on their own. There'll be a lot of vaccination legislation coming, I think 30-plus bills or so. So that'll be interesting to cover. In addition to the two parties, there is sort of a third party in the State House right now, and they call themselves many things. Some people think of them as the Free Staters, the Freedom Caucus. I will say it's not the old Free Staters that I remember from many years ago. And I don't think they particularly care about an election race. They want to get their issues through right now. They are effective, so I think it's, at your peril if you underestimate them and think they don't have a real voice in the legislature. We were talking earlier, and I think Kevin made a good point. Even if they don't get their legislation through, they can stop legislation that they don't want, because while they're not a majority, they are effective.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought that up, Annmarie, because I did want to talk a little bit about dynamics of politics, specifically in the House. And Kevin, let's start with you, and then we'll move on to Adam, and then finish up with Annmarie again. It is an odd political dynamic in the House. The Republicans control both the House and Senate, but in the House, it's, to me, a very split caucus between what I would describe as sort of traditional conservative Republicans, your father's Republican Party, if you will, and then this new, very aggressive Freedom Caucus, whether it's made up of Free Staters or people who align with libertarian philosophy. And Kevin, just talk a little bit about how that plays out in terms of the House moving its agenda forward.
Yeah, it certainly makes for a real challenge, and we're seeing that with Speaker Sherman Packard. I mean, he was very successful at the end of the day in 2021 in getting a lot adopted that he wanted to have adopted, especially in that budget, as Adam pointed out, to get a lot done. But when you've got this very small majority that the Republicans have, it's the smallest in the New Hampshire House since World War II, that their majority right now, there is no margin for error. So you have these tribes, splinter groups, caucuses, whatever you want to call them, and there's many, and they go by many different names. The House Republican Alliance is another group that's got some influence. Each one of them can have enormous impact on policy, whether things happen or they don't happen. We saw that in the session last week, where on a number of these retained bills, you had committee majorities supporting these bills, but you had people in some of the caucuses that weren't satisfied with the results. So that's part of why you had a number of these bills last week put on the table, because they're still trying to get all of their ducks in a row and people in support. What's unique about this Republican majority as well is that, because you rarely see this in either party, is that their leadership is very much in tune with these groups. I mean, Majority Leader Jason Osborne, is a Free State Republican, somebody who is not a Free Stater per se, but he philosophically agrees with a lot of what they want to do. And he is very close to people in the Freedom Caucus and communicates with them freely, and they feel very emboldened to talk with him. As David will recall, I mean, that's not the usual dynamic in a legislative body. At the end of the day, in most legislatures over the years, you had to serve for a number of terms before you could even give a speech on the floor of the House. Most freshman members never got to sponsor legislation unless the leadership decided you could. But as Annmarie pointed out, these members really feel empowered. Individually they do. And in many respects, the pandemic has given them more power, right? Because there's less communication and contact that the majority party has with their members face to face. It's in those face-to-face meetings where majority or minority leaders can talk with a wayward member and kind of get them to see they're not going about it the right way. You're not having that communication, and we see the result now, which is more chaos.
So Adam, what does that mean in terms of how the House and Senate work with each other? As bills come out of the House that may have the strong backing of the Freedom Alliance and the Republican majority, what does it mean for those bills when they cross over into the Senate? In other words, is there a Freedom Alliance in the Senate? And if not, how do you see those bills moving forward?
Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, the quote-unquote your father's Republican Party, that's more the dynamic of the Senate, right? And as Kevin was talking about the sort of evolution of politics at the State House, that evolution has not quite reached the State Senate yet, because you do still have a very traditional top-down caucus there, run by Chuck Morse and Jeb Bradley, who effectively have probably been the two most powerful people in state government consistently over the last decade. And I mean, to the extent that there is a Freedom Caucus in the Senate, you know, you have senators like Harold French and Bob Guida, who aren't organized in any specific way around that, but tend to agree more with that line of thinking. I think when you see, and to piggyback off of what Kevin said, you know, Jason Osborne has been very, very effective as a leader, and I think he considers it job number one to pay attention to the caucus and cultivate the relationships and keep that communication open, as opposed to other majority leaders. He doesn't make his case in the press. He doesn't try to win the argument in public. He is in constant communication with those members and keeping them in line. Rewinding to 2017, 2018, a lot of people were looking at the Republican majority that was there and wondering how the heck do they keep on losing on these big issues that they have. They didn't have that connection and that cohesiveness with a majority that's bigger than the one they have now. So the House, with that sort of attention to the ideological base, does end up sending the Senate things that they're looking at and thinking less ideologically and more in the big picture of, you know, wanting to continue to be in power and win elections. You know, they're going to kind of look at these things and say, well, what can we do to this to make it a bit more mainstream? And I think you saw that in effect, in particular, last year with the divisive concepts bill that was folded into HB2. You know, the House had a very explicit kind of list, a piece of legislation within the budget trailer bill, and then it got to the Senate, and it was worked on by the powers that be there, sort of the Morse Bradley coalition, and then they brought the Attorney General in, and you came back with something that was a little less specific, I guess is the way to put it, but they believe it affected the same policy. The base of the party, you know, the Free Staters and the people who wanted to really explicitly ban critical race theory from being taught in schools and other, you know, diversity trainings and stuff like that, they were pretty disappointed with what came out of that. So that's the push, the tug of war that goes on there. And it's interesting because I think, you know, in terms of legislative prose, you know, Morse and Bradley have sort of been unchallenged in that title for a long time, right? In particular, I mean, you have a former member of Congress there in Jeb Bradley, who really, really knows what he's doing. And I think they finally encountered someone in Jason Osborne, working along with Sherm Packard, who is just as effective at getting what he wants. And so that's why, you know, these negotiations that kind of go on behind the scenes over these things will be really interesting to see what happens in this particular session. And not to hog the mic too much, I'll give it to Annmarie real quick, but I think one of the first sort of tests that we're going to see in the unity of the House Republican caucus is the desire to get back into Reps Hall. Because the Freedom Caucus really wants to reconvene in Reps Hall and you know, go back there elbow to elbow and say, let's do the people's business in Reps Hall. With, you know, I'm sure there will be perhaps some consideration of the pandemic, but there's a lot of concern around that with other members, and certainly Speaker Packard has a responsibility with the health protocols. And so I've heard from members of the Freedom Caucus who say, we want to push this at least in February, we want to be back. And that could be the thing that starts to tip some of the dominoes where they don't want to play nice anymore.
That's an excellent segue for a question I wanted to ask Annmarie, which revolves around the pandemic. We're now into our third year, or at least our third session, and each session has had a slightly different response to the pandemic. Annmarie, could you talk about what is especially happening in the House, but it also includes the Senate? How is the legislative business being conducted How has it changed how the public interacts with the legislature? And how has it changed how reporters interact with the legislature?
It was so different last year. There was remote hearings, which are continuing this year, but there was remote testimony. And so I think that really helped the public participate. People who hadn't been able to participate before, maybe they live in the North Country, or they don't have transportation, or they have young kids at home, or they're working. So they were able, we saw, I think, a lot more participation from different kinds of people. I'm not sure in the end of the day it carried the debate, but their voices were heard in ways we hadn't seen before. So this year it will be remote live feeds and no public testimony, and there's been quite an effort to return that option to testify remotely. I don't see it going anywhere. It's sort of been a hard no on that. As a reporter, I will say that live feed can be helpful because it's recorded. So for the first time, I can be in 3 places at once. I can watch the hearing, I can go back and watch the other hearing, and then later in the day watch the other hearing. So that's helpful to me. I much prefer to be in the legislature, talking to people face to face. So there's a trade-off there. It's much easier, it's easier to hear, but there is that loss of seeing people face to face. And if I could just add one thing to what Kevin and Adam said, I think this online legislating last year, especially for first-time lawmakers, it's easy to throw bombs over the internet when you don't see where they land. And so if they come back to the session, I think it'll be interesting to watch to see if that interpersonal kind of relationship changes, if it's less coarse, which I think it could be. And we had a couple of hot mic moments this session where women were called very unflattering things. And I'm sure that there's been muttering under your breath before, but now it's caught on tape. And the apology was also noticeable. It wasn't a profuse apology. So there is a coarseness now. The deputy speaker, we talked to him just before the session, and he said, my hope is when they do return to the legislature, the structure and the hall will have some sobering effect on them. And they'll see that this is bigger than them. They'll have to look in the face of someone they're criticizing. I guess I'm not convinced of that yet, but I think it's worth hoping for.
Kevin, I think it was Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan who once coined a phrase, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Do you think that's still true?
That's a good question. I mean, certainly during this pandemic, and the discussion about COVID-19 and the response to it, there's been a lot of discourse about people not trusting the science, not believing what experts are telling them about what the science says, and that's really unfortunate. But it's sort of, I think it is a sign of the times. I think the pandemic has made this this dynamic worse, but to be sure. But over time, with more and more people getting more and more of their information from social media and not trusted sources of information, then it shouldn't be any shock that you end up with people who have beliefs that may be considered outside the mainstream because they're not functioning in the mainstream. That's not where they're getting their information, or that's not who they're consulting for advice. And unfortunately, as I say, even once the pandemic is over, I don't think that dynamic's going to change. I think we're going to always be, for some time now, we're in this phase of people being very distrustful of not just government, but authority figures in general.
So Adam, let me start with you, and then we'll work our way back. Going to move from the 20,000-foot level down to the 5,000-foot level. We've talked a little bit about the number of vaccine-related or COVID-19-related bills, and Annmarie said she thought it was 30 or 40. I think it might be more like 50 or 60. There is a lot of them out there. Aside from that, what do you see as being some of the other key legislative issues that you expect to see debated this session?
Well, I think, right off the bat, obviously, the energy efficiency issue is one that they're trying to push and move very quickly. Obviously, the whole situation with the Public Utilities Commission decision to alter that program in such a way that was going to be fairly detrimental to the companies that perform that work. There are jobs on the line. Politicians and jobs go hand in hand. They want to keep those things. And so I think we saw in the House session last week, it was a unanimous vote of this, very divisive, fractured group there. They all got together. I think they were cheering, if I remember correctly from the live feed. So I would say that right off the bat, if you're looking for one thing that has to be done quickly because those jobs are on the line, it's going to be that energy efficiency program and how they try to bring that back in a way that both satisfies the desire to not raise people's rates too much and keep things going in terms of the jobs.
Great. Kevin, your thoughts, other issues that you expect to see focus on?
Well, I certainly think there's going to continue to be a desire by conservatives to, economic conservatives, to keep cutting taxes. And we saw with this last budget, a whole raft of tax cuts were in it, cutting the room and meals tax, the business taxes. There's legislation already filed now to cut the communication services tax, to have another round of business tax cuts. I think particularly in election year, certainly House Republicans are going to try and advance that as well. One issue that's not gotten a whole lot of attention, but is interesting certainly to me, is, as we know, we have a big problem with workforce housing and affordable housing in New Hampshire, and when a few years ago, under Republican leadership, they had, with Republican support, I should say, in 2017, they created a housing appeals board, which allows landlords to go and appeal, and tenants to bring disputes to this board. That's had some success and some appeal from landlords, but we're seeing now, certainly in the real estate community, a real desire for New Hampshire to create what would be called basically a land court, in which you would have, much like as you see with the housing court, the family court, in other words, to break out a whole segment of the judicial branch that's just devoted to landlord and tenant disputes. Former Supreme Court Chief Justice Robert Lynn is sponsoring that bill, and it has a lot of support in that rental community. It'll be interesting to see how that comes out.
Yeah, it reminds me, and you'll remember this going back at least 10 years, if not more. There was a bill that became law to establish a business docket, a separate part of the court where when a conflict arises between businesses, they could go directly to this docket, this court, to get their case heard much quicker. So I think it's along those lines.
Yep.
Annmarie, how about you? Any high-profile issues that you think will come up that haven't been discussed yet?
I think education will be right up there with vaccines. There's all kinds of bills. My colleague Ethan Dewitt takes the lead on this for us, and there's more issues and bills than he can get to. We've seen an attempt to expand the so-called divisive concepts bill to the higher ed. I think that was heard today. So I could very well see that moving forward and being successful. There's vaccine discussion at schools. There's an effort to remove all mandated vaccines, even the ones that have never been controversial, at least in our lifetimes, as well as the not permit a COVID vaccine requirement. And in the past, that's been theoretical because there was not an effort to mandate the vaccine at schools, and DHHS said it had no interest in doing so. But there is a bill this year that will attempt that, so that's become very real, I think. And so education and the vaccine bills, and I think there's the issue of the bills, and then there's a second higher issue of what does this say about the state, the idea of local control or individual choice for businesses has been replaced with individual control. So for local schools, for example, they don't want to leave it to a school board or a school district to make their own choices, which we have always seen. The parents now are the person who has the power. Businesses they don't want to let them mandate vaccines, for their own employees or their own shops. They want that to be in the hands of the individual. So those two issues, I think, are illustrative of this larger shift that we're seeing. And so we'll be watching both those.
So I have one last question that I'll ask. Annmarie, hold on to that because we'll start with you. One last question to ask all of the panelists, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So my question is, where is the governor in all of this? Can you describe what his style of leadership is in terms of, does he have an agenda that he wants to move forward through the legislature? If so, how does he go about doing that? So why don't you take first whack at this, and then we'll hear from the other panelists.
That's a good question. I'll be interested to hear what my colleagues say. Sometimes I can't figure out what his agenda is exactly. I think last session the budget allowed him to not get stained, so to speak, from issues he may not be crazy about. He wasn't in favor of all aspects of the abortion ban, namely that there was a mandated ultrasound included in that, which was very unpopular. But he said it was in the budget. I can't veto the budget. I can't veto the budget over divisive concepts. So this is different this year because there isn't the protection of that budget. We see him weekly at these press conferences, his COVID updates, and it feels to me like the focus right now is all COVID, getting federal resources into the state to take care of hospitals. That's mostly what we hear him talk about. And when you do ask him specifically, it's still, well, we'll see, not sure. So for an example, he has said that he would support making the vaccine registry an opt-in versus an opt-out, which it's a harder burden to get over, to get people signed on to something. And public health officials feel like if you don't have all of those people in there, it becomes meaningless. And yesterday he said, well, I would prefer opt-out, but I guess I'd have opt-in over nothing. And he's famous for saying, I'm going to twist the arms of the executive council and get them to do what I want, or FEMA. So I said, are you going to, lobby those lawmakers who are in favor of opt-in? Are you going to twist their arms? And he said, I don't twist arms. I'm not an arm twister. So it's day to day. I feel like it's day to day.
Kevin?
Yeah, that is one similarity between Chris Sununu and John Lynch. I mean, ideologically very different, personality very different, their backgrounds very different, but both never saw themselves as legislator in chief, and both have always tried to stay above the fray, and not get into the blocking and tackling that occurs every day on the House and Senate floor. This governor has a really good relationship with Senate President Chuck Norris, and when you have a Republican majority in the state Senate, as he has now and has had, that can allow you to take a very offstandish approach to a lot of legislation because the Senate can be a backstop, like Adam talked about. I think what's really going to be interesting to me with this governor, who's running for a fourth term, which is kind of rarefied air. John Lynch is the only one who's done it in over 100 years, is to see how he conducts himself in the background with a lot of these fringe Republicans, very conservative Republicans, not only members of the Freedom Caucus, but, I guess what I'm saying is if he's looking at a midterm election in which he could win re-election, I really feel as if his desire is not just to continue to have a Republican majority in the legislature, it's maybe to have a different Republican majority, right? And meaning, I would be shocked if he would not love to have the 12 people who moved to impeach him from office no longer in the Republican caucus. And as somebody who is, a popular governor running for re-election, likely to have no serious primary, he can really dictate, as titular head of the party, the kind of recruitment effort that could occur in some of these legislative districts to try and primary some Republicans that he'd rather not be there anymore.
Adam, thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I think, it's one of the sort of the sign of the times that that we live in, that Governor Sununu has laid out a exquisite playbook for Republicans to win office and continue to win office. And a huge segment of his party has basically just been like, yeah, no thanks. Like we don't, we that doesn't concern us. And so it's it's a head scratcher as an observer and a reporter where you're like, wow, he can, he did a good job in 2020 with the coattails and getting a lot of these folks elected. And again, sign of the times, there is no loyalty. There's no, no thanks, Governor. No, no recognition that he probably did carry the executive council in the House right along with him, with former President Trump in an assist there too. And I think to me the bigger question is what's next for Chris Sununu, because he said he's not running for U.S. Senate, and he also, did it in a way that basically probably made it so no U.S. senator is ever going to want to be really good buddies with him. And yet, where is he today? Where is Governor Sununu? He's in Washington, talking to the Cato Institute about how he managed the COVID-19 pandemic. And he's going to be doing a thing with the Washington Post, talking about leadership in the pandemic. And if you've been watching any interviews that he's been doing, several of them lately with national outlets, he's not saying no when these people are asking him if he was thinking about running for president someday. So that's going to be a really fascinating thing to watch, I think, as he tries to, and again, the conventional wisdom is if you're going to run for a national office like president, you need a national platform like the U.S. Senate. He has said no to that national platform. So if that is his intention, we know he is trying to raise his national profile, but if he really is interested in running for president of the United States, he needs to find a way to boost that national profile without being in the U.S. Senate or without having that perch. And to me, it's going to be fascinating to watch and see what he does and how he does it over the next 2 or 3 years.
Interesting, thank you. Questions from the audience? Do you mind standing up and bellowing out your question?
Absolutely. So I admittedly have a city interest in this, so it's an important question. But the last time we received COVID dollars, we were operating under an emergency order. And those dollars went out pretty quickly because there wasn't much, there was a committee, and boom, those dollars were back out into the community, in the hands of everyone who needed them. There's a significant amount of money coming back to the states. And I've yet to figure out how those dollars are going to be dispersed. But we know that we have, people interested in transportation. We know we have people interested in housing. We have people interested in all kinds of things that those dollars will be directly sent back to. And the city has some real specific interests, like a highway you travel and a bridge you go over and such. So can you get a read on how those dollars are going to be dispersed? And should I be concerned at all that it's an election year and everybody's going to be worried about who gets credit and not? And will there be a process and such?
Who wants to field that one?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question, Mayor. Because you're right. I mean, during the state of emergency, everything went through this governor and the go for office, and the legislature wasn't dealt out of the situation, but they were just advisory, and now they're very much knee-deep in it. I think the infrastructure bill is a good example, right? Which is to say, you've still got, we're hearing from mayors, selectmen, and high-ranking state officials basically saying, we're still waiting on how this money is, how we can give this money out. In other words, what are the rules of the road for the infrastructure programs? And I think they're still kind of coming together. I do think particularly when it comes to non-vaccine related issues, the Republican-led legislature will try to be accommodating as much as possible because it's in their best interest. If there's money to be distributed, let's get it out there. So I'm hopeful over time we're going to see more and more activity, but and that primarily, like I say, a lot of it may end up going through the Legislative Fiscal Committee rather than through the legislative process, because again, if it's ARPA money, the American Recovery Act program, then the beauty of all this money that's going out right now, at the end of the day, from a process standpoint, okay, is none of it was in the state budget. So because none of it was in the state budget, that basically means none of it has to go through the Byzantine process that you have when you create a state budget. So in theory, virtually all of this money can just monthly go through the Legislative Fiscal Committee and then go out. Certainly, that's the way this governor hopes it works, and he's not getting at least from what we see yet, any pushback from the legislative leadership about, no, we want hearings, we want oversight. I think there's going to be a lot of oversight about COVID money, don't get me wrong. After 2022 election, whoever's in charge of the legislature, I submit to you, they're going to go under the hood and look at how this money went out and was it as efficient as possible, and did it go where it should have gone, because that's a real concern. I mean, another big budget issue this year, which cities and towns should be concerned about because it can affect them in a positive way, is right now we're on course to have a revenue surplus in the order of over $250 million. So it's certainly legitimate for city and town officials to ask, are we going to get a piece of that? You know, as we're trying to put together budgets where, yeah, there's a lot of local aid in this last state budget, but there were a lot of downshifted costs that continue to be downshifted, like the retirement costs that cities and towns had to pay, which really didn't get resolved. I think that's going to be a really interesting discussion. It's not going to really heat up until after crossover, because I think legislative leaders want to wait until March and April when those big revenue months come in. They'll have a better idea of, how big's this nest egg? Because if it's 200 million, the solution is one. If it's 300 million, the solution is another. And I think, as we've seen in the past, we've seen Governor Sununu willing to distribute some of that money, particularly if it's not an ongoing commitment, of dollars, rather, as he's done before, kind of a one-time boost to help cities and towns with more revenue sharing.
I could just add,
Please.
I think I would agree with all of that. Also, when the rescue money came in, it was available to towns, and some cities got their own money. I was calling towns to ask, how are you going to use this money? I can't tell you how many places called and said, well, I don't even know how to apply, so I think we're going to forego it. And it was millions of dollars. Or they would say, well, it's just for bridges, and we don't have any bridges in this tiny town, so we have no idea what to do with it. And the town of Dummer decided not to take the money. They were the one town, I think. So at the end, that took the press to highlight that issue for them. And in the end, they eventually did. Most of them applied. But even when they did, they didn't understand how broadly they could use that money. And so Gopher doesn't really exist in the way it did. I think I would call Taylor Caswell and ask him, what can we do with this money? He's always walking around downtown Concord, so you probably can find him. And I think that's the year you need to start with. And there's not a lot of organized outreach, but I think maybe you would find that the best route to go.
Just want to quickly check in. Do we have any questions from our online audience?
Not yet.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Tim?
Right, yes. We hear a lot about investment in infrastructure. From the business community's perspective, workforce is such a challenge right now, and I'm wondering, what types of trends you see in the legislature that may be happening through bills that address workforce issues. We just, literally, everybody is out looking for people, and it's really a chronic problem.
Yeah, yeah, you're right, Tim. One of the biggest problems, of course, that we have here with workforce is, one, there's really no easy solution, and two, the pandemic makes it that much harder to even come up with solutions once, if you can find some. I think one issue will be interesting to see whether the legislative leadership, particularly on the House side, can get behind this idea, is this pilot program that the governor has with regard to student debt forgiveness, for a certain amount of student debt forgiveness in exchange for college graduates who agree to stay in the state and work the state for at least 4 years. There are a number of conservatives in the House who don't like the idea, simply because because they see it kind of as a snapshot in time. In other words, my kids just went through college; they didn't get anything like this. When all the federal money runs out 4 years from now, the future kids aren't going to get any program like this. So the governor's had a real hard time convincing the legislature to support this idea. He tried to get it in the budget. It was one of the major things they wouldn't give to him. He's now trying to create this pilot program using ARPA money to do it for a few years, and they're not even supportive of that yet. There's no question that it's a big problem, and it certainly is a major issue that's facing state government now, right? I mean, if you think about what's been happening over the last couple of years, we really haven't quantified it yet, right? But I've thought to myself, since the pandemic began, how many thousands of jobs in New Hampshire are being done by people working for private contractors who have been designated to do all these tasks because state government doesn't have enough people to do them. It's a staggering number. And P.S., a lot of those people doing those jobs aren't here in New Hampshire. You create the call center in New Hampshire, but you can have people manning that call center for New Hampshire all across the country. That's what a lot of these staffing companies are able to do remotely, is not just provide staff in the state, but also provide staff that are available to the state. What happens when, like I say, when all that money goes away? Who does a lot of those jobs? It's a real problem.
Well, we're approaching the end of this program session. I'd like to thank our panelists. You were all terrific. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge. And Tim, would you like me to turn it over to you for some closing comments?
Sure, thank you, David. I just want to echo David Juve's comment. It was really great having this panel here. It's really inside baseball, so a completely different perspective from how we've run these programs in the past, and I really appreciate your time and your effort and your insights. It was quite educational for me, so thank you so much for being here and giving us your time. And again, thank you to Ledyard Bank for supporting this program, Scott Laughinghouse and all the team at Ledyard, and thank you to those people who are here in person and to those who joined us virtually, and we hope to see you soon at a future chamber event. Have a great day, everybody.